Oh, yeah? A wise guy, eh?
Why, you...
Welcome to another edition of Pod Jerky. I'm your host, Tom, and on today's episode, we have a writer and a fellow Canadian, Geoff Dale. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be on.
So you're from Woodstock, Ontario?
That's right. Originally born in London, England, and moved to Canada many years ago.
Yeah, that's great. And you are working on a book, and I believe it's called The Fine Art of Boxing, No Stooges in the Ring.
No, that's actually my previous book.
Oh, that's a different book.
That was one I published a couple of years ago. That was basically about Larry Fine and his sort of adventures as a amateur boxer before he became a stooge. This book isn't quite written yet. It should be done by the early part of 2021. It's about Shemp Howard. Basically, it's sort of discovering or rediscovering Shemp Howard.
And he was one of the original Stooges, if I'm not mistaken. He was actually part of a trio that was with another comedian that started off the Stooges thing before they actually went onto TV.
Absolutely. Basically, they started under a well-known comedian, actor, whatever you want to call him back then, by the name of Ted Healy. And he put together, and they weren't the Stooges originally, of course, but this is way back in the 1920s. He sort of was friends with Mo Howard originally, and Shemp, who was older than Mo, of course. Shemp became, you could call him the constant of the trio. Later on, Larry Fine joined. So they were on the go, in the late 20s and through the 30s. And under many different names. So basically, it was Ted Healy's group. That's the key from the beginning, before they became the Stooges. And Shemp was his go-to stooge, if you want to call him that. And basically, some of the names they had under him were Ted Healy and his Southern Gentlemen, Ted Healy and his Racketeers. And at one point, actually, over a business dispute, they broke off and just simply called themselves Howard, Fine, and Howard, and also the Three Lost Souls. So that had a long history. Shemp had a very long history with Ted Healy. And Ted Healy, I don't know how much you know about him. He was a much taller gent. And, of course, the Stooges, Shemp, by the way, was apparently the tallest. I think he towered up to about, depends on what particular biography you look at. He's either 5'5", 5'6", or a gigantic 5'7". So Healy was a much bigger man, and he basically taught them all the ropes. And their act essentially was on stage. It was vaudeville. And that's where they got their beginnings. And they did make a feature film together, too. And this was 1930. And the film was called From Soup to Nuts. And it was basically devised as a vehicle for Ted Healy. He was the lead. But the interesting part about that was Soup to Nuts. It went fairly well, but Ted Healy wasn't offered any major contracts or anything. But behind the scenes, the Stooges were offered a contract. Or at that point, of course, they were the Southern Gentlemen, I believe. And so that created a little bit of an issue. So they all went off. They basically, he managed to, curtail that effort. They didn't get the contract, and they broke away as Howard, Fine, and Howard. And in a short time, basically, Shemp went out on his own. So that's where Shemp really started, in and around 1932, 1933. It was Shemp alone. No Racketeers, no Ted Healy, and it was just Shemp Howard in the movies now, not on stage. So that's the beginning.
And they're from a Jewish descent, and his actual real name was Shmuley or Shmuel.
Yeah.
And his English name came out to Samuel. But his mother couldn't say it properly, I guess, and it would come out as Shemp, and that's how Shem Stuck.
Yeah, well, they sort of thought it sounded like Shemp, so that was a real hoot for his friends and other family members, of course. So they started calling him Shemp, and she was trying to say Sam, but she had a fairly strong Lithuanian accent. That's where a lot of the Jewish people, the community came from in those days, from Eastern Europe, places in Russia and such. They wanted to escape the persecution, the economic trials, and just plain bigotry and all the rest against them. And they did well on the eastern coast. So the family name was Horowitz. Then again, you could say it was, there's different variations, Horowitz, Garwitz. So I guess simply for the sake of anglicizing the name for the show business community, which they did, they opted for Howard. And Shemp, whose real name was Samuel, or in Jewish, as you pointed out, Shmuel. Shem Stuck, it was a great name, thanks to his mom. She probably didn't know that and realize that. And Harry Moses became just simply Mo. He'd worked under Harry for quite some time. And Larry was Louis Feinberg. He was from Philadelphia. But 1930 and 1932, that area, that's where Shemp really broke away. And he became the sort of, he was the solo. He was the guy who basically had a solo career, as opposed to either Curly, who was his younger brother, Mo, or Larry. I mean, they did a few things on their own, but Shemp definitely went out on his own, and he had a very successful career starting around 1933.
Yeah, and he was in movies with John Wayne, Marlene Dietrich, and a few others that he was playing, I guess, a gangster type player or a like a goon, I would say.
Yeah, he sort of, mainly speaking, he did the comedic role. That was what he was good at. He was known for being a good ad-libber. So, I mean, people who think that ad-libbing in comedy routines was invented these days, that's not true. There was a lot of good ad-libbers back then, and Shemp was one of them. He was a good physical comedian. He had an interesting look. I mean, quite frankly, if you look back at some of the early pictures of Shemp, he looked like sort of a hippie before his time. I mean, he had pretty long hair. And, of course, Mo, they consider Mo to have sort of invented the Beatle haircut. So he was a little bit of a wild-looking guy. And Larry, of course, with the balding head with the wild sort of stringy hair sticking out. But Shemp had that look. And unlike a lot of other comedians of that time, he did try, as you pointed out, some dramatic stuff, and that was quite interesting. He was quite successful. I mean, he played up against, as you said, John Wayne in a movie in 1942 that was for Universal called Pittsburgh. Not a completely dramatic role, but sort of half straight and half comedic. And in the early days, he started off with a company called Vitaphone Studios, which was a branch of Warner Brothers. He did a lot of work with, for instance, Jack Healy, who played the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. That was about 5 years before that movie came out. Well-known people of the day. Bert Lahr, that was an independent film he made called Henry VIII. That was also before The Wizard of Oz came out. So he got to actually act with a lot of really well-known people. Some of them before they got their name in show business or in film, and some of them who were already quite well known. So, and as you pointed out, John Wayne was another. That was a little later on. There was a series all about boxing called Joe Palooka. I don't know if you are aware of the old comic strip Joe Palooka.
No.
Okay, it was basically sort of a big, dumb, blonde guy who's sort of a bit of a country rube. And Shemp takes him on. Shemp becomes the manager trainer. And, it's funny, but it was a bit of drama, too. And that's where he really hit it big, because the star of that particular series of 9 shorts, actually Shemp did 7 of them, he was not overlooked, but the attention sort of was on Shemp. And that's what the advertising sort of focused on, Shemp. Critics were talking about Shemp. And one of the reasons is that Shemp was a huge, huge boxing fan all his life. And so he knew how to talk like someone in the boxing business. I mean, he knew the patter, the banter. He knew the movements. He had a really funny sort of a shuffle he used to do, decades before Muhammad Ali did his Ali shuffle. There was Shemp shuffling around. So he did a great job in that. And in between that early stage, he did a film for an independent company in 1935. It was for Falcon Pictures. It was called Convention Girl. And things had been cleaned up in Hollywood a little bit at that point with what was called the Hays Code. But this was all about, the bad old days in Atlantic City, shall we say. And Shemp, if you can believe it, the comedic Shemp, he played it completely straight. I mean, the movie wasn't all that great, but every time he appeared, you'd say, "That's Shemp?" He had sort of sharp-looking clothes on. He was basically a small-time hood. His specialty was basically blackmail and just anything for a dollar. He even tries to kill his partner. So, people who didn't think that an actor like Shemp, known for being a Stooge-like character, those who didn't think that he could do a dramatic role, well, they were really mistaken. And when he got to Universal, or actually he got to Columbia first to do some shorts, when he moved from Brooklyn to Hollywood and did a series of work for Columbia. That was before he got back with the Stooges, of course. But Universal was where he really made his name. And I'm assuming you probably know people like names like W.C. Fields and Abbott and Costello.
Yep.
Yeah. And, well, he had some nice parts. I mean, he wasn't a star. He wasn't the feature performer. But he had some good parts. The Bank Dick with W.C. Fields, he played the bartender. Great role. Edited down quite a bit, as the roles in those days were. But a nice role. And then in 42, he teamed up with John Wayne. And John Wayne, by the way, they lived in the same neighborhood. So John Wayne occasionally Shemp didn't drive, so John Wayne would drive him to the studio, which was kind of cool. And Bob Hope, by the way, lived in the area, and he used to drive him to the studio too. But anyone who wants to see Shemp in action in a big budget film, check out Pittsburgh. It's got John Wayne, Randolph Scott, and Marlene Dietrich. It's a hoot seeing Shemp. It's really cool. And Abbott and Costello, he did a handful for them, about 5 or 6 features. Very, very good. Some smaller roles, some a little more substance to them, but good, good recognition. And Universal, I think, at least in my opinion, I think was really good for Shemp. He got to appear in one of the Thin Man films, which were really popular in the day. That was an independent enterprise. He, like I said, Abbott Costello, Rudy Valley, the singer, Georgie Jessel, who became the Toastmaster General of the United States, and all kinds of folks. I mean, he wasn't just a guy who was out there sort of scraping around. I mean, he got some decent parts and got himself really known in the film community, and I think really respected. So that's a little bit of history about him. Would you like to know a little bit about his personal life?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Well, him and his wife, he married back in Brooklyn. His wife's name was Gertrude, but she was known as Babe. It seems like everyone back then was known as Babe. Oliver Hardy was Babe. Curly, they used to call him Babe. But anyway, his wife, Babe, they used to hold these great parties all the time, every week. And they'd have all kinds of people over. John Wayne would drop over, some of the major comics, the Bowery Boys, a couple of those, Hunt's Hall, he was in them. And one that I forgot to mention this, you might find this interesting, he occasionally dropped around, and it was James Stewart. James Stewart, or Jimmy Stewart, whatever you like to call him, he actually had his film debut in a Shemp short back in 1934 called Art Trouble. He was uncredited. He got $50 for the deal. By the way, that was really good money at the time.
Yeah.
So for anyone who wants to know where the Oscar-winning James Stewart started, it was with Shemp Howard, believe it or not. So
yeah, wow.
We're going to take a quick break to show some love to another podcast.
Hey, this is Dub,
And Les.
and we're your hosts of Goals Podcast, where we are
Genuinely out, actively lifting society. Whether that's through inspiring interviews with amazing guests,
or just giving you our own unique perspectives to give you a positive impact on your day.
yes, and we're here every Tuesday to help brighten your week.
So catch us on all your favorite platforms that you like to listen to podcasts.
That's right, we're on all listening platforms and all social media platforms. Check us out.
Goals Podcast. Peace.
Deuces.
That was Dub and Les from the Goals Podcast. Make sure you tune in and hit that subscribe button. Yeah, and some of the stuff that I was reading about prior to doing this podcast even, I think was very, very, very smart of him in order to promote himself in a movie just like Pittsburgh, like we were talking about. And he was promoted as the ugliest man in Hollywood. And that would gain him like attention into the movie with John Wayne and Marlene Dietrich, right?
Yeah, well, they even promoted the film. There was a big spread that the company put out, Universal put out. And, you know, they mentioned, of course, Marlene Dietrich and John Wayne and Randolph Scott. But they also said, and featuring the ugliest man in Hollywood. One of the things back there, back at that time, was agents and managers, they had some pretty good ideas. And Shemp was smart, too. He had a very, how'd you say, a rubbery kind of face. He could really pull some really incredibly strange-looking faces. So they cooked up this deal prior to this movie. It was on the set, I believe, of another film that he made, and he got some people in the community, some acting friends, MC. They had a little ceremony. They voted on it, 6 judges or whatever, and an actress gave him a trophy. You have now been awarded the title of the ugliest man in Hollywood, and he basically just took this to town, and he sort of loved it. I mean, it's sort of self-effacing humor, but I mean, he took it in this sort of, he took it in his stride, and it was well intentioned. It was meant to be comedic and funny, and it worked. It did work. I mean, because he sort of utilized this rubbery, very, very comedic appealing face that he had, and it got him work.
Well, it's marketing genius. I mean, if he's able to do that, and then people start to realize, hey, this is the ugliest man in Hollywood, and want to book him just because of his name or his moniker there, it's genius. Yeah, it is. They seem to forget. I mean, it's a combination of things that get known. I mean, a lot of people mistakenly say, well, he never really starred in any films and that, but he had good roles. And he played up against good people. And when you sort of utilize your looks, your abilities to be quick on your feet, be a physical comedian, and hell, be the ugliest man in Hollywood, I mean, you got it going for you. And, these were interesting times because the early days, before he became the ugliest man in Hollywood, back in Vitaphone, that was in the height of the Depression. I mean, those were horrible times. People were out of work, incredible amount of unemployment, and even some of the people in the entertainment business. But he worked. He continually worked. He worked at Vitaphone. He worked at Columbia. Then he continued to work at Universal. Some of this was contractual work. Some of it was sort of as the work came up. That was what it was like initially. But he was a working actor. And that definition, I mean, fit him perfectly. So there you go. You got some titles for him. The ugliest man in Hollywood, a working actor. I mean, he had a lot going for him, and he took advantage of it. And he had all those people at his house every, I don't know exactly what day on the weekend it was, but he had these parties. And I mean, it was the talk of the town. You going to Shemp and Babe Howard's place this weekend? It's going to be a hoot. We got lots of people there. Jamie Stewart might be there. John Wayne might be there. Maybe a couple of the Bowery Boys might be there. And maybe W.C. Fields might drop by. And if you do, you better stock up on the booze for that guy. But great stuff. It's just fun. It's fun, not just... There's sort of a thing with Shemp fans. I think there's a much, much, much larger group of people who are sort of all of a sudden realizing that, Curly, Larry, and Moe were the sort of the known names. This is what people grew up with. But then they see Shemp,
And they start to, one of the games basically is when you turn on something like the TCM networks, Turner Broadcasting, and you watch the classic films, and Shemp fans like to sit there and go, look in the middle of this drama, there's Shemp, he's there again. And it's a game we kind of play. And the key here is, and I guess you know a little bit about this, but I can explain more, is eventually his solo career, sadly, came to an end, not because it wasn't successful, but because Curly had a series of strokes and sort of basically had a really bad stroke, which sort of finished him for good. I mean, it was in the middle of one of their films that he was doing, and very, very sad. And basically, they started to look desperately for another performer, because the film that they were working on, Halfwit's Holiday, that was completed. They looked all over for people. Mo wanted Shemp. He basically wanted Shemp. He was a family member. He knew the routine, and so that was it. So back in around 46, helping with a little bit of sort of promotional stuff on live promotional stuff and things like that, they started working on their shorts together. And in 1947, they got together. It was now Shemp, Mo, and Larry, or Mo, Larry, Shemp, whatever you like to call it. And the short was called Fright Night. I don't know whether this was actually planned. I got a feeling it was. And guess what the topic was? It was boxing. And how bright is that? That's the way to get Shemp back in, and that's where it started. So he, on his own, did 105 feature films with a number of roles that he had in all of those. And with the Stooges, he was now set to do, I believe it would have been 77, I believe, thereabouts. Yeah, 77 films are in the area of that. So he was back in another course of his career. I don't think he really wanted it that much, but he felt a family obligation, and he loved his brothers. Of course, his brothers Mo and Curly, and got along well with Larry. And sadly, of course, Curly died at the age of 52, I believe, in 1951, thereabouts. I don't have that right in front of me, so very young age. But he was back with the Three Stooges now. So
yeah, and I was watching some clips this morning, and when I was growing up, and this was a long time ago, like I'm 41 now, I would say this is probably in my teens. My grandparents were huge fans of the Three Stooges. They were huge fans of I Love Lucy. So anytime we went over there, they didn't have any cable, but they had all of the episodes recorded on the VHS tapes. So we would get a chance to watch some of those. Hard to remember a lot of them just because it's been such a long time since I've watched them. But I did watch a few clips this morning and watch Shemp do that actual boxing shuffle like you were speaking of earlier, with a much larger gentleman where, they were just trying to exchange punches or slaps, and he was ducking and juking and jiving and all that. And that was pretty funny. And then I didn't even realize that Curly actually came back on set one time, and it was the four of them that actually got to appear together in one scene. It was the only scene that they ever appeared on. And that was, I think, one of the famous times, like where where he was sleeping, and he would make that sound like he was snoring, and then me, 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 me. And that gets copied a lot in comedy today. So that was actually cool to go back and remember watching that.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because that, like you said very correctly, that was the only time they appeared together on film. There could have been a second time, but it didn't happen. They had a publicity shot, everything. It was in one of their shorts. I believe it was The Malice in the Palace, and I believe it was basically Curly had a big handlebar mustache, was very thin, and he was a chef. And there's a number of stills out there, pictures, but it was cut. It didn't make it into the film. But the one you're talking about, yes, he was. It was he was there sleeping on there, and Larry and Shemp and Mo were saying, "Listen to that guy! What strange sounds that guy is making," and that was kind of cool. That's a bit of history, like you said. The Four Stooges together, the only time the three brothers, of course, Shemp, Curly, and Mo, on film together. And that's something too, by the way, during their stint as the Stooges with Shemp, they did a lot of work on the side, which is really, quite profitable. I mean, the Stooges weren't rich. I mean, they weren't the multi-million-dollar stars we know today, but they did okay. They did a lot of work for guest appearances and such. And actually, at one point in 1949, with the help of Milton Berle's brother, they made a TV pilot, if you can believe it. It's called Jerks of All Trades. It didn't get picked up, but it was really interesting. And the rumor, or not the rumor, I spoke to someone in the Berle family, and they said Shemp and the brother, the Berle brother, were sort of key to this particular pilot, like I said. And I got a copy of that. It's not bad. It got turned down, but it's a little bit of history. It's considered to be one of the first, if not first, TV pilot ever made. Didn't make it, but still. And one of the things with Shemp, another thing about his family, like you talk about boxing, they used to go out every, I know it was on weekends, Friday or whatever, and possibly even during the week. And it used to turn out, they used to be in the front row with Shemp there, and Shemp would get up in the middle of a fight, or as a round ended, he'd be swinging his fists, he'd be dancing and jiving, he'd be carrying on. The whole crowd was watching Shemp. And at some point, the corners in the fighters' group there, like say a trainer or whatever, or not one of the cornermen, would jump off the ringside and start waving towels and patting him down on the head to wipe off the sweat off of Shemp. And that would get a big applause. So, I mean, Shemp became the show at boxing cards. So there he was, He was a born entertainer. He was naturally funny, and if he thought he could sort of add a little entertainment of his own to what was going on, he did it. He just loved boxing.
Yeah, and do you think that the Three Stooges, well, I guess all four of them, do you think that they were trendsetters for the way comedy is today?
Well, I think this is my personal opinion, so if anyone disagrees with me, they're quite welcome. A fellow Canadian of ours, Jim Carrey, quite honestly, I think if there were no Three Stooges, Jim Carrey maybe would have made a living, I don't know, but I don't think he would have been like he is today, because a lot of the stuff he did in his earlier work was very Stooge-oriented. I tried, in fact, to reach him, but no luck there. I'd love to ask him about that. And in fact, I'd love to ask him, I wanted to ask him for the book. Well, Curly, Larry, Moe, those are the known Stooges. What do you think about Shemp? Did he have any influence on your career at all? And I think you're right. I think in a lot of respects, the Stooges, remarkably, I mean, you're talking about a group that by 1920, I don't know, say 25, 26, thereabouts, 23, when you get to 2023, we're talking about the formation of a group 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. Not only could you consider them to some degree to be trendsetters, they've really not lost a lot of their basic fan base. I mean, you're 41. No, I'm older than that. I won't tell you how old, but I'm old. When I came from England originally, that was a no-no for my parents. They'd heard about the Three Stooges. Oh God, no. Violent slapping, poking of the eyes, none of that nonsense. So basically, that was an invitation to sneak a peek every time I could.
Right.
But they've got new fans, and contrary to what people tend to believe, I'm not suggesting all women like them, but not all women hate the Stooges. Far from it. I've got some family members who are female, and they love the Stooges. And it's just because it's basic good. It's very well done humor. I mean, despite all the constrictive budgets, the cutbacks over the years, by the time Shemp got there, there wasn't as much attention to the shorts. I mean, the shorts industry was sort of rapidly declining, and basically the Columbia shorts were really the only ones around. The Stooges were it, and he did a great job. He was one. That was another one of his talents, at least I think it is that he could work against weaker material, less money being put in, and still be funny. I mean, I think he was and still is very funny. And I believe that a lot of people who get the opportunity to check out some of the older films, maybe by going to the Turner Network, the classic movies, or just ordering something up on wherever you can get them. They'd be very, very, very surprised. And of course, we talked about the boxing. I don't know if you know, he died coming home from a boxing match. He was in the back of the car with his buddies, back of a taxi, because he didn't drive. And they were telling jokes, and he lit up a cigar and just about to say something, and bang, his head fell into the lap of one of his friends, and he was dead that night. So he saw the fights, loved them, did his thing, and that very night, at the age of 60, a few hours later, he was gone. It was reported as a heart attack, but I believe one of his relatives said it was a cerebral hemorrhage, I believe. So whatever the case was, he was gone, and that was it. And
it's funny that you mentioned that he didn't drive, because I was actually reading a funny fact on him, is that he did drive as a teen, but he ended up driving his car through a barbershop window. And after that, he never drove again.
Yes. Yeah. And basically, he didn't drive again. His wife didn't drive. And he had some fears. I mean, I think to a certain extent, some of his fears were kind of exaggerated, I think, for publicity's sake. And, you can make an interesting story, a phobia, even more interesting when you sort of embellish it a lot. But yeah, he didn't drive. He didn't like airplanes, so he didn't do that. He didn't really care, apparently, for trains very much. So travel, I guess, in some respects was rather limited for him. But he, like I said, he got rides all over the place. John Wayne, Bob Hope, rides to the studio. But that early incident, way back, I mean, basically, he wasn't a driver. And it's interesting. And of course, this is reasonably famous, I think. The fact is that when he did die, there were 4 more shorts to be done on the contract. So hence the fake Shemp. They had to sort of basically cobble together old stock footage from earlier material so that he was in it. And also they hired a stand-in, a sort of the quote-unquote fake Shemp. By the way, the fake Shemp came from film director, I always mispronounce his name, Sam Raimi. Yeah. He quoted that, the fake Shemp. His name was Jim Palma. Some incorrect information too about Jim Palma. Jim Palma did some work with Shemp back in the 40s on solo. He had a pretty decent career. I mean, he wasn't just the fake Shemp. He became the personal assistant and the stand-in for Jack Lemmon later. So he's interesting too. I mean, Jim Palma did some good stuff, but he will forever be the fake Shemp. And every so often you'll find a director these days who will make reference to the fake Shemp in his particular production. And that's what it's all about. The 4 films were completed. They, people can pick and nitpick and all the rest. Probably not as good as the remaining 70 odd, but they were done. So Shemp, who often gets labeled the forgotten Stooge, for me is anything but forgotten. And the real purpose of the book, it's actually got a dual purpose now. What I wrote the book, or why I'm writing the book, is simply because I think people need to know more about what are sort of the underrated stars that sort of flew under the radar. And I think now that we're into this pandemic, the COVID-19 era, I think people could use a chuckle. And this is what I'm hoping they're going to get out of the book.
Yeah, and you actually got to interview some of the actual family members, the granddaughters, the grandkids actually, and the kids of Shemp. And you got to hear some inside stories that normal people wouldn't actually get to hear about him. Do you want to share any of those without going into too much detail to give it away from the book?
Oh, sure. I mean, I flew to Los Angeles a couple of years ago, and I had an interview, face-to-face interview with his oldest granddaughter, and I hope she doesn't mind that because she's not old. But anyway, she's the older of the 2, Jill. And we had a great chat over lunch, and she talked about all kinds of things. I mean, for example, back then you sort of take things, you want to play the piano. So what do? You don't necessarily have to take lessons. You just want to learn how to accompany people. So you teach yourself. Well, that's what he did. So occasionally at one of the parties, he'd get together with someone. I don't know if you know, one of the big supporting stars for the Stooges was a gent by the name of Vernon Dent. Do you remember him?
No.
He's a sort of biggish. He's not real big. He's about 5'9", but rather stocky. Always had a mustache. Usually played the villain. Sort of a master of what they call the slow burn. He sort of just was keeping it in before he exploded. Anyway, he happened to be a very, very good singer. So, and not that I have any evidence of this, but apparently there were times when Shemp would plunk himself down in front of the piano, and Vernon Dent would come along, and he'd sing, and Shemp would play the piano, and things of that nature. Shemp was also, by the way, a very, very keen gardener. Used to love growing things. Unlike a lot of people back then, I mean, he certainly, had a few drinks now and then, but he was fairly careful. I mean, he smoked cigars, so I guess he wasn't that careful, but anyway, smoked cigars, an occasional pipe, and some cigarettes, but he did actually take care of himself reasonably well. He didn't go out and boozing all the time. He didn't sort of party it up. He loved, absolutely, and this is one thing that his granddaughter Jill and Sandy, the younger one, and also the daughter-in-law who's around, Jerry. She was married to Shemp's son, Mort, who died many years ago. She said, first and foremost, Shemp was like a family man. He absolutely loved family. He hardly ever talked about anything else but family. And quite often at a party, one of those parties where all the adults, he'd see one of the children was there, and they'd be sitting at a little table by themselves, and he'd go over and he'd chat with them and, sort of make them laugh. I mean, he was amazingly enough, there's all kinds of tales about Hollywood types, and you probably know as many as I do. There's absolutely nothing that I could find that would cast the dark shadow on Shemp, So if anyone's wondering, I'm sorry to tell you, Shemp did not have an affair with Marilyn Monroe. Didn't happen. Would have made great reading, I suppose. But he was a family man. He loved it. He loved his friends. He loved his work. And when he was back home, that's what he did. He fished too, by the way. So despite the fact that one of his supposed phobias was water, he did fish. He liked fishing with his son, Mort. And he was just a family guy who happened to be famous as one of the Three Stooges. In my book, the original. So there's a little sample of what he did when he was home. Watched television a lot, by the way.
Yeah. And they've remade, I guess, a Three Stooges movie with Will Sasso, Sean Hayes, and Chris Diamantopoulos.
Yes.
What did you think about that movie?
Well, the funny thing was, it was the Farrelly brothers who made it. And I like their stuff, generally speaking. I took it in the spirit that it was sort of made, and that was that it was a comic fictionalized version of Curly Larry Moe. It wasn't intended to be any fact at all. I mean, they had, as you say, a couple of the actors were Canadians. Are Canadians. I thought it was funny. I enjoyed it. I mean, let's put it this way. Anytime I can see Larry David as a Mother Superior, he's got to be funny. That's almost as funny as the Stooge representations in that movie. I thought it worked. Surprisingly enough, I used to be a film critic, so for the Hamilton Spectator, and I'm always looking at box office numbers. And interestingly enough, I mean, it didn't make the number one film of the week or the month, but it made money. And the rumor is that the Farrelly brothers are considering making a sequel or another film. I've also tried to reach them, but with no luck, sadly enough. And my question for them would be, if you did make another film, would you include Shemp? Because I think that would be great. I think it would be. You can fictionalize it again if you want. The movie actually that came out on television on, I can't remember what year off the top of my head, it was a Mel Gibson production. I mean, it was basically touted as being the story, the real story. Well, there was a lot of fiction in that. Some stuff that just wasn't true. But nonetheless, it was interesting to see. I did actually speak or do an online interview with the actor, John Kessler, who played Shemp in that particular TV movie. And he was just thrilled. He loved it. He loves Shemp. And I don't know the name, but he's famous for being the voice of the Crypt Keeper on that series. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. That's his claim to fame. Okay. So, I'd love to see the Farrelly brothers take a stab at it. But let's get Shemp in there. Or
So
hell,
if they did make do a remake or a part 2 of this, a continuation of this, of another movie, who would you cast as Shemp?
boy, that's a good question. You know something, I really don't know. I mean, if he was a little younger, because although, you know, it doesn't really make any difference to me, someone like Jim Carrey probably do a great job, even though most of his characterizations that I think he borrows from the Stooges are probably more related to Curly. I think he'd probably do a good job. I'd like to see someone about the right height, to be honest.
Yeah.
Jim Carrey's about, well, of course, a couple of the Stooges there in the Fairley film, they're not short.
No.
5'11", 6 foot. I'd like to see someone though around to be honest, at this stage, I don't know. I just can't think of anyone who would be good. Maybe you've got some ideas and you can put out the word. Hey, maybe if you're talking to the Fairleys and I can't reach them, you can say, look, there's a book coming out. Why don't you do a take on the book? So there, I can make a few extra dollars that way. How's that for plugging my own property?
Yeah, that's right. There you go.
You can say it's written by the ugliest writer in Woodstock, Ontario. You know, I can't go with anything.
Well, then you have a moniker there. It's no different than doing something on, say, social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, and getting people to follow you just because you did something different than anybody else did. So, you know, you plug yourself as the ugliest writer in Ontario or in Canada, and you know what? You're going to get people to start following you and
exactly.
purchasing your products, right? It's just marketing. It's a genius plug.
Well, I was always a hippie. That shows you how old I am. But now, since COVID-19, I don't like going to the hairdressers or barbers anyway. So I'm even worse. I mean, you know, I look like something out of the Duck Dynasty. In fact, I look like the Duck Dynasty guys back in the 70s. So, you know, I think I got some. And I do, by the way, this book is being published. I do have a publisher. It's an American publisher, Bear Manor Media. It's a great company because basically all they do is books related to entertainment. And a lot of it's sort of stuff that the bigger companies, not that this isn't a big company, that they just would say, nah, not interested. I was kind of fortunate in a way. This is total luck on my part. I didn't have to go hunting around for a publisher. They looked for me. So I was delighted. So look out for sometime in early 2021, and it should be out. And keep my fingers crossed that people get a chuckle, and then they rename Shemp the Not Forgotten Stooge.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So you have your other book, but which we talked about right at the intro part of this podcast, which was called The Fine Art of Boxing, No Stooges in the Ring. Can you let people know where they can find that book? Pretty much only one place, Amazon. It was self-published. For any writers out there, I've been a writer actually since I started off as a film critic for the Hamilton Spectator back in the 70s. So I've been doing it for a long time. Haven't written I've written a few books, self-published and the like. The Larry Fine book, it's funny, the publisher I have now said if he'd known about that back then, a few years ago, he would have loved to have published that. But the only place you can get it is on Amazon, and that would be in the form of an ebook. The Shemp Howard book is going to be, I believe, it's definitely print, most likely ebook, and even possibly audio for those, visual problems. And I got to get everyone involved. Get the name of Shemp out there. I've got a Shemp mask I'm wearing, by the way, for COVID. A Shemp T-shirt. I'm thinking about buying my Shemp for president, even though I'm not an American. You know, Shemp. Don't go for Trump. Go for Shemp. He's not alive, but hey. Yeah. And do you have a working title for your book? Not yet. We're sort of tossing around a couple of ideas that we haven't decided yet because my publisher really wants to have a look at the whole thing as it is. So I have a designer for the front cover and back cover. We're sort of looking at, the idea of spotlighting Shemp, but I don't think we want to go with the Forgotten Stooge because that would just sort of amplify something that's not really true. So we have kind of working titles, but nothing yet. I'm thinking possibly by Christmas, if I'm really, really, really getting towards the end, that we may have a much better idea. And then I'm thinking at this point, and that's the time to get back to doing some podcasts. Hopefully maybe a return visit with you again, that would be great. Because as far as Canada goes, other than going to the website for Bear Manor Media, it's probably going to end up me
trying to sell it from my place. And I suspect a little bit negative. I don't think there's going to be personal appearances, any promotional tours, because I suspect that we're still going to be in the grips of, to some extent, of COVID-19, sad to say. So you need something to laugh at.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, for sure. Definitely in December around Christmas time. Yeah, just get back in contact with me. We will have you back on the show. We'll help you promote your book. Try to get it out to Canadians that aren't really aware of Shemp Howard or the Three Stooges and want to read up more on it and check out your writing material.
Right. That'd be great. I appreciate that very much. And it's been great talking with you. It's always nice. I have done a few Canadian podcasts, and that's great. Love to keep it local. You know, let's. I also like that in a way. That's kind of strange. My publisher did tell me. He said, you know, I've been trying for years to get a hold of someone to write this book. I mean, many years, and then I showed up. So here I am. You know, born in England, raised in Canada. So a Canadian is writing the book. So,
and an American publisher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, we that shows we can all get along. You know.
Yeah.
You know, the symbol of peace. You know, a poke in the eye and a slap and a bit of Shemp, and that's it. That's how you get peace.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we want to thank you for coming on the show today. We appreciate you coming on and telling us about your upcoming project and the book that you're working on. And then we will have you back on so that we can actually talk about the book once it is just about to be published. We can, you know, name the title and let people know where they're going to be able to find it once it's ready to be published. And we'll go from there. So thank you very much for coming on today's show.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and to you and all your listeners, stay happy and stay safe, and we'll get back to you sometime, hopefully towards the Christmas season.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. And as always, stay safe, be kind to each other, and we will see you later.